Hey there, art nerds. So today I'm going to walk you guys through the final stages, the finishing touches of a watercolor illustration. This is something I've demonstrated several times before, but today I'm going to talk about it more in depth and kind of walk you guys through those final touches that help pull a watercolor piece together. So we're going to be starting at this stage here, almost complete, but still needing a little extra TLC. We're at the almost complete stage. I've come to this with fresh eyes on a fresh morning. All of the base colors have been added in, all of the shadowing has been added in, and this is a perfect opportunity to kind of reassess things and add final details, like surface design on this kiddo shirt here. Now, one of the reasons you might not want to add surface design earlier on is that if you need to glaze or adjust the color, it can melt that surface design and you can lose the pattern. Now, sometimes you might want that. That can be perfect for indicating that it's something in the distance. But in this instance here, we want it nice and clean and kind of sharp. It also kind of allows us to decide what might be too busy or what might be too complicated. So you guys can see the little girl next to them already has a cherry blossom design on her shirt. By waiting towards the end, I can decide whether or not adding more surface design on their clothing would be too busy or would add some personality. At this stage, I'm also going back and adding another layer on top of the skin tone. So all of their skin tone mixes have had plenty of time to dry out. They're in a ceramic palette, so they're easy to reconstitute. So this gives us a more saturated mix that we can work with. And it also allows us to add in those contouring shadows that'll help give additional definition to the face. And I'm going to do this for all of the characters here. I've been holding off for this point so that I can kind of work on everybody fairly uniformly so that they all look like they're in the same environment and they all kind of match one another. This is also a good opportunity to add a little additional blush if you want to, or a little additional of the skin tone shadow mix that I've mixed up custom for all of the different kids to actually match with their skin tones. If you guys are interested in more in-depth tutorials on the basics of painting and drawing people, I have a full playlist that I'll link for you guys. This is just kind of part of a mini tutorial series where I walk you guys through specific aspects of watercolor paintings that I frequently use. I'm using a smaller brush for this, and I'm not reconstituting all of the paint. I'm basically grabbing a little bit and painting it wet over dry, so glazing it on top of the prior layers. And my goal isn't to disrupt those previous layers, but to kind of harmonize the colors that I've got going on. It's a little bit challenging to see from this angle, but I'm also adding in some stray wispy hairs using the base hair color that I've mixed for each of these characters. This was a suggestion that my students gave me a couple of years ago. They said that my hair was too uniform and too blocky and it felt kind of static, but by adding a few stray hairs here and there, it'll add a lot of life to it. And I love that suggestion, and it has worked out quite well for me, so now I'm sharing it with you guys. But basically, I wait till almost the end of the painting to add those stray hairs for the same reason I might wait to add surface design. I don't want them to be totally melted into what I'm doing. I'm also adding in some additional shadow on our guinea pig to just kind of make it look like these kids are actually on top of the guinea pig, and adding some cast shadow. For the stray hairs, you want to use a finer brush and you want to use a more saturated mix. This will give you a little bit more control. I'm also filling in the eyelashes since when I ink them kind of open, so there's actually a gap between the two lines of the eyelids, and this allows me to go back and use the hair color to kind of paint in the eyelashes. I'm also using this as an opportunity to kind of reassess the hair, add in some more shadow, let things kind of develop. So one of the big components to waiting till the next day, coming at this with fresh eyes, is not only do you want to allow the paper to dry out fully and the pigments to settle, but you want to give your brain a chance to refresh. You can get kind of oversaturated if you've been painting for a longer session, and it can be hard to make good decisions, and you can end up overworking a piece. So now I'm going to do a little bit of re-inking for contrast. So this originally started its life as a Lilliputian Living illustration from my yearly challenge at Lilliputian Living. And it's an inked art challenge. And I've just kind of kept the nature of it being an inked watercolor illustration. This allows me to also share the inked sketches and the line arts with my patrons over on Patreon. I'm not re-inking the entire thing, but even though watercolor is thought of as a see-through or a translucent medium, it is often semi-opaque and opaque, and sometimes that opacity can be useful in obscuring the line art and kind of denoting a lightness or a closeness to the light source. But also you can lose your contrast and it can start to become muddy, especially if you like to use black line art like I do. So re-inking it at the end of the painting, and not even re-inking the whole thing, just adding in some additional inks to kind of clean things up, can be really helpful for kind of re-establishing that contrast and kind of rebalancing the illustration. Also going back in and adding some darker shadows and low lights can kind of help rebalance the contrast. And this is usually something I do at the end of the painting because I've had a chance to let things dry and to think about things. So this is what the painting looks like re-inked. Now I'm going to go in with just a little bit white gouache. I do wish I had grabbed a smaller brush for this. I generally like to use a pretty snappy synthetic brush for adding in gouache because it can kind of stand up to the heavy bodiness of gouache. If you're new to watercolor, gouache is an opaque watercolor medium. They work well together. Watercolor purists do not like when you go mixed media. I'm a comic artist, so I don't really care what they think, but I'm just sharing that information in case you want to like enter a contest or something. You may find that people turn their noses up, but it's up to you in the end. What I like about this is it's perfect for adding like whiskers and highlights, rim lights on shiny objects, or highlights in hair. It can also be useful for just kind of readjusting things. You can also mix your white gouache with watercolor colors to achieve pastel colors. This can be really useful for adding in surface details, or for adding patterns onto clothing, or for kind of adding a bit of a rim light to skin, since the white gouache is actually a little bit blue in tone and doesn't work so well for adding highlights to skin tones. I also find that semi-opaque or opaque Jaune Brilliant is great for adding highlights to skin tones. This example, I'm actually going to use some white gouache to do a paisley pattern on the kid's shirt. And I'm working at 4x here, so different aspects of this little tutorial have been sped up to different amounts, kind of depending on what I thought you guys needed to see. I'm trying to make sure that these are shorter and more digestible, since I know the 2-hour-long videos are a bit much for a lot of people, myself included. So hopefully this is a little bit easier. So with white gouache, you can water it down a little bit and make it more transparent, and this can be great for building up layers of your color, layers of your white, so that we can kind of develop our shadow. So for me, I'm kind of starting out with a first layer of our white gouache, allowing it to dry, and then the areas that are going to be closer to the light source, I'm going to go back over it and add just a little bit more white, like you guys see here, to kind of imply there's more light hitting that area, that those whites are just a little bit brighter. You can also paint on top of your white gouache. You can wait till it's fully dry and glaze on top of it, or hit it while it's still wet and get kind of a diffused wet into wet blend and kind of soften that edge. It really kind of depends on what you're looking for. I'm painting on Arches cotton rag watercolor paper for this illustration, in case you guys are curious. And I find that these kind of cotton rag cold press papers are really good for these kind of illustrations that take a lot of layering and a lot of different watercolor techniques like wet into wet. So that would be what I would recommend for something like this. So remember how I mentioned earlier that you can take your white gouache and mix it with some color watercolor and achieve a pastel color? That's what I did to get this kind of pastel red. I wasn't really going for a pink, but kind of like a red highlight or a red thread line on her outfit. Since this illustration is a classroom, I really wanted to depict a lot of different personalities by using surface design and color choices to kind of imply who might own which of these articles. So you guys see me doing a little sashiko on the bag in the background. And then for the coats, I wanted to leave them kind of simple because if these were Lilliputians and they were trying to get from point A to point B without being seen by humans, blending in would be better. So all of the bright colors are actually underneath their coats, and their coats are more intended for camouflage. So I'm adding a little bit of shadow color on top of my gouache just so that it doesn't stand out so much and to get it to blend in just a little bit better. At the start of this illustration, I did an underpainting using purples for the underpainting, and I've got some of that shadow color that I'm bringing back to add shadow to the wall. I find that doing these kind of underpaintings can really help unify an illustration, and I've got a whole tutorial where I explain how to use different colors, so grise, blueye, brunette, and more, to do an underpainting that will kind of help unify your painting, especially for something like this where we actually have a lot of different bright colors going on and we need something to kind of help unify the whole. Finally, once I'm done adding my adjustments and everything has had a chance to dry out fully, I can carefully remove my blue painter's tape by peeling away at a 90-degree angle. For some of the longer strips, I find that they get really caught on the back of my gator board, so I'm going to peel the back first and then remove the front. And I find that it makes it a lot easier for me to remove the tape. Now, some folks will use a hairdryer to help kind of melt the adhesive and make it a little bit easier to remove the tape. I haven't had too many problems though, and I'm using Chinese watercolor weights just to kind of hold it down and to prevent it from further buckling. I do live in Louisiana. It is incredibly humid here. It was raining on the night that I painted this so that I could take some photos and share it with you guys. And here is the finished watercolor illustration. Thank you guys so much for joining me for these final finishing touches. Hopefully this inspired you in some ways that you can kind of tie that watercolor illustration together, especially if it still feels a little bit disjointed and you're not sure why. Big thanks to my amazing patrons on Patreon. They help make tutorials like this one possible through their financial support. If you want to join their hallowed ranks, you can join them at patreon.com/natosoup and get early access to videos like this one, as well as printable coloring sheets. Thank you guys so much.